In the sweltering heat of northern India, 1857, crowds gathered not by choice, but by force, made to witness what many considered the ultimate desecration of both body and soul in the dusty parade grounds of Peshawar and the ancient squares of Delhi. British colonial forces had perfected a method of execution that served not merely to end life, but to strike terror into the hearts of entire communities. Death by cannon. Lord Dalhousie, Governor-General of India, would later write in his private correspondence, "The spectacle is as terrible as it is impressive, precisely the effect we seek in these troubled times." The practice known officially as blowing from a gun represented far more than mere capital punishment. It was psychological warfare manifested in its most grotesque form. The condemned would be led to a field artillery piece, typically a 9-pounder cannon, and tied securely to its mouth at the parade ground in Lahore, where many such executions took place. Witnesses described how the condemned were often forced to walk past the collected fragments of previous victims. When the cannon fired, the body would be literally torn apart with fragments scattered across the landscape. A deliberate denial of proper funeral rites that held immense significance in Indian cultural and religious traditions. The method wasn't new to India. Persian armies had employed it centuries earlier, notably during Nadir Shah's invasion of 1739, and the Mughal occasionally used it with Emperor Aurangzeb, ordering its use against religious dissidents in 1672. However, it was under British colonial rule that it became systematized as an instrument of state terror, reaching its apex during the Indian Rebellion of 1857. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Griffith of the 61st Regiment, stationed at the Delhi Ridge, described the aftermath of one such execution in his memoirs. The effect of the discharge was overwhelming. The body was literally blown, which was scattered far and wide, some fragments being found on the roofs of houses hundreds of yards away. What made this form of execution particularly chilling was its theatrical nature. British authorities would often force local inhabitants to watch, sometimes keeping detailed records of attendance at the Lucknow residency registers from 1857 show that on average 200–300 locals were compelled to attend each execution. Captain Henry Nichols wrote in his diary, "In June 1857, the natives were made to attend in numbers, and I observed many turning pale at the sight. That was precisely our intention, to instill fear that would travel far beyond the execution." Ground in Jhansi, where the rebellious Rani Lakshmibai had once ruled, British officers would ensure that the executions coincided with market days to maximize their audience. The psychological impact reverberated through generations in the bazaars of Lahore and Delhi. Mothers would quiet unruly children with whispered warnings about the demon cannon. The poet Mirza Ghalib, who witnessed several such executions in Delhi, wrote in his diary, "The city has become a slaughterhouse, where death comes not from the sword, but from the roar of devils made of iron." Local witnesses, accounts preserved in family histories and folk songs, speak of the profound trauma. One such account, from an anonymous source in Awadh, describes how the sound would echo through the city walls, and if at all, during the height of the 1857 rebellion, the British significantly increased the frequency of these executions. In a single day in Peshawar, 40 rebels were executed by cannon. Their deaths staggered throughout the day to maximize the terror of a garrison where the 46th Native Infantry had mutinied. 24 executions were carried out in just 2 hours. Colonel James Brind noted in his correspondence to Lord Canning, "The spectacle had the desired effect. The city, which had been restive, maintained an uneasy peace for months afterward." The British justification for this brutal method often centered on its supposed deterrent effect. Sir John Lawrence, Chief Commissioner of Punjab, argued in an 1858 dispatch to London that normal modes of execution were insufficient to maintain order in what he termed a land of fanatics. The cost-effectiveness of the method was even discussed in colonial administrative documents. Each execution required only a small charge of powder, roughly a quarter, the normal amount used for firing the cannon. Yet documents from the period suggest another motivation. The deliberate destruction of the body prevented proper funeral rites and deep-seated religious beliefs about the afterlife. The impact on colonial resistance was complex. While the method certainly inspired terror, it also fueled deep-seated resentment that would eventually contribute to the independence movement. The revolutionary leader Akak Damodar Savarkar, in his 1909 work, The Indian War of Independence, every blast of their cannons planted seeds of liberation in our hearts. In the Punjabi city of Amritsar, where several such executions took place, local bards composed songs of lament that would later become rallying cries for independence activists. The practice reflected broader changes in colonial administration, marking a shift from the relatively collaborative approach of the East India Company era to a more direct and brutal form of imperial control after 1857. This transformation symbolized the growing racial and cultural divide rulers and ruled, contributing to the hardening of colonial attitudes that would characterize the late Victorian era. The historian William Dalrymple notes that this period marked the death of the last remnants of cultural cooperation between Britain and India. The last recorded instance of blowing from a cannon in British India occurred in 1859 in the small town of Fataga, where 3 remaining rebels from Tantia Tope. The S-Force met their end, but its memory lived on in folktales, family histories, and the collective trauma of communities. The practice became emblematic of colonial brutality, showing how technological superiority could be perverted into instruments of terror, in the words of Sir George Campbell, Lieutenant Governor of Bengal. We ruled by fear because we could not rule by love. The legacy of these executions stretched far beyond the moment of death itself. The terror they instilled was not just confined to the immediate aftermath, but rippled through the communities for years to come. In the wake of each execution, the psychological scars were deeper than any physical injury. The deliberate humiliation of the condemned and the destruction of their bodies prevented the proper performance of funeral rites, a sacred practice in Indian culture and religion. A person's soul was believed to be incomplete without the right burial, which is why the British use of cannon as an execution method served not only as a punishment, but as a profound cultural and spiritual violation. Not just the body, but the very soul of the condemned, their suffering reaching its full psychological toll by the fact that their bodies were shattered and denied the peace of death witnessed by all in such a brutal and public manner. The British did not just break bodies. They shattered entire communities by using executions as a tool of fear that would last for generations. The impact on local populations was far-reaching. The psychological burden of witnessing such violence caused the local population to live in constant fear. The trauma left behind from seeing the bodies of the condemned torn apart and scattered over great distances was deeply embedded in the collective memory of the people. Those who survived would never forget the cannon's roar, nor the image of their fellow countrymen's brutal end. Every blast of the cannon instilled a sense of helplessness and despair into the hearts of the people, making them fearful not just of immediate death, but of what their future held under British rule. In towns like Delhi and Lucknow, the memory of these executions was passed down through generations. Stories of the horrors experienced by those who witnessed them were kept alive through folk songs, family histories, and public discourse. Mothers would use the fear of the cannon to keep their children in line, warning them of the consequences of rebellion, telling them that the cannon would take their lives away. The executions also served to fuel resentment against the British colonial rulers. The more the British used the cannon to execute rebels, the more it contributed to the growing resistance movement that would eventually result in the 1857 rebellion's significance in the Indian independence struggle. Far from quelling dissent, the British methods of execution intensified the desire for freedom, especially among the intellectuals and revolutionaries, who saw these methods as symbols of the deep injustices of British rule. Figures like Damodar Savarkar wrote that every cannon blast spread. The emotional toll on the population was so great that many began to see the British execution tactics not as a deterrent, but as a rallying cry for liberation. This shift was particularly evident in the poetry and songs. Local poets and bards began to compose and sing of the atrocities carried out by the British, a tradition that continued long after the end of the songs that lamented the fate of the condemned soon became anthems for the freedom fighters. Many of these songs were passed down through families and became part of the collective memory of those who lived through the reign of terror. As the use of the cannon as an execution method increased, so too did the resistance it sparked. The executions became a catalyst for many uprisings throughout India. Those who had witnessed the brutality of the cannon would often join the ranks of the rebels joining the cause of independence, not out of mere political ideology, but out of a deep sense of injustice and a burning desire for retribution. Those who survived the terror of the cannon found strength in their shared suffering and became a part of the larger movement against British imperialism. These survivors carried the weight of their experiences with them for the rest of their lives, many becoming key figures in the independence movement. Their stories of survival and resistance gave rise to a new kind of political and social awakening among the Indian populace. This new awareness would eventually coalesce into the larger movement for independence in the 20th century. By the time the last recorded instance of blowing from a cannon took place in 1859 in the town of Fataga, it was clear that the tactic had lost much of its power as a tool of fear. The British had succeeded in terrifying the population, but they had also managed to create an indomitable spirit. They had alienated themselves from the very people they sought to control. The cannon became a symbol of oppression, and in the minds of many, it represented the depth of the British colonial. The practice was a reminder of the sheer brutality with which the British ruled India, and it left an indelible mark on the collective consciousness of the Indian people. Even after the formal end of the rebellion, the memory of these executions lived on in the minds of those who had witnessed them and passed on the stories to future generations. The brutal method of execution was emblematic of British imperial rule, which relied on power through terror rather than the consent of the governed. The more the British used violence as a tool of control, the more they distanced themselves from the people they ruled. The cultural and spiritual significance of death in Indian society led to a breakdown in their relationship with the local population. The British had not just targeted the bodies of the condemned, they had attempted to break the spirit of the entire Indian society. The very essence of life and death, the British had made their rule more fragile than they realized. What they failed to understand was that the destruction of one's body could not destroy one's spirit. As the British continued to use the cannon in executions, they failed to realize that each blast was strengthening the resolve of the people they sought to oppress. The psychological damage inflicted upon the Indian population became a source of strength, rather than fear over. The people who had once been cowed by its noise now rallied to its sound. The cannon was not just an act of terror, but a call to action for those who had witnessed the horrors of British rule. The revolt of 1857 was not the last gasp of resistance, but the beginning of a long struggle for independence that would eventually lead to India's freedom in 1947. While the British may have sought to quell rebellion through their brutal methods of execution, they inadvertently sparked a fire that would eventually lead to the end of their rule. The use of the cannon and the brutality it represented became a rallying point for independence movements that would spread across India. The legacy of the cannon lives on today as a testament to the resilience of the Indian people and the brutality of British colonial rule. From a cannon ended in 1859, its memory remains as a powerful reminder of the lengths to which colonial powers would go to maintain control and the strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable brutality.